Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here. Simply, I'm a doctor. I'm a pediatrician. I'm in clinic, and I'm trying to prevent my kids from having adverse health outcomes later on in life. Because the histories that I was hearing from the kids who were walking in my door were intense. Kids who are witnessing homicides, attempted homicides, kids who are dealing with parents with substance dependence, mental illness, really deep poverty, kids whose parents are being deported, all kinds of issues along that front. When I started diving into the science of how this was affecting our kids and came across the ACES study and came across the research around toxic stress, we immediately started thinking about, okay, how can we put this into practice? So we started with just doing a retrospective chart review of all the kids that we saw in the first 2 years to see if we looked in their chart whether we saw any documentation of ACEs. And so we used this form right here, and we just went through the criteria, and then we added our own additional categories, which included homelessness, traumatic incident, foster care system involvement, and then witness to violence or abuse. And so we started by going from a system where I would walk out of the exam room, walk into my psychologist's office, cry, then say, what do I do? And then go back into the exam room and then come up with some counsel from the parents. We created this thing called Multidisciplinary Rounds. Physicians, psychologist, our case manager, and our lead medical assistant or receptionist. And so we included these folks in multidisciplinary rounds, and it was a weekly meeting where we could say, where I as the clinician could say, hey, listen, I saw this, that, the other at this well child check. I'm really concerned about this kid's behavior. I'm concerned about their learning. I'm concerned about, whatever it is. And then as a team, we would divide and conquer. So my psychologist would say, okay, I'll reach out and I'll call mom and make sure they get plugged into mental health services. Our case manager will say, okay, I will try to help them find housing. I will contact the school about an IEP or whatever it was. And it was just such relief of the burden, because it was so intense for me as a clinician to be holding all these things, that having this weekly process where I know that I may be seeing something right now in this exam, in this visit, but I already know I have a disposition for it. And so it just made the process much easier. What we simply did, now this is not a sophisticated scientific methodology. We simply took that same screening piece of paper and we stuck it in the confidential tab of the medical record. And so now when I was going in to do physicals, I just flip open the confidential tab. I would ask parents, I would do a verbal screening. If there was 1 to 3 ACEs without symptoms, then I would do anticipatory guidance. And the reason that we did it that way was simply because if you have 1 to 3 ACEs, and sometimes one ACE could be, absence of, POPs isn't there, right? Which in our community with a little bit of a social norm, I'm sad to say, right? So 1 to 3 ACEs with no symptoms, I did anticipatory guidance. And the reason is because if the child is not having any symptoms, sometimes it's hard to motivate a parent to do anything too much differently than what they're doing, right? But I'll say, oh, you know what? How your history of domestic violence, or how your child's history of witnessing domestic violence affects the health and development of kids, is that we know that they're more likely to have increased risk of this, that, and the other. So if you see any of those things, we got lots of services here for you. Let us know. You need to not only mitigate the physiologic impacts of toxic stress within the child, but you have to ultimately, the goal is to reduce the dose of adversity that the child experiences. And you also want to support that parent so that they can provide the social emotional buffering, because we're not taking these kids out the hood. I'm sorry. I don't know if that's a crass way to say it, but these kids are dealing with trauma and violence and poverty that's right outside their doorstep. Having a parent who can help to keep the stressful and traumatic experiences that our kids see in the category of tolerable stress and not toxic stress, where it disrupts brain architecture and organ systems, that is the imperative of two-generation work. You have to support the parent to be a social emotional buffer, the parent or the caregiver. One of the things that's really challenging, or at least it was really challenging for me, was seeing all these kids struggling and knowing the deep impacts of what was going on with them and recognizing that the systems that serve them have not caught up yet, right? How can we screen if we don't know what the best interventions are? Well, how do we get resources for these interventions if we don't have documentation of the prevalence, et cetera, et cetera? And so I think that we all need to be pioneers in pushing for the importance of screening in the primary care home and intervention. So I want to take a second to thank all of our supporters who helped make this work possible at the Bayview Child Health Center and the Center for Youth Wellness. And I'm just so thrilled to be able to be doing this work. Thank you.